The Department of Health and Human Services says it's found a systemic disregard for the sanctity of life in the American organ transplant system. The Health Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., calls the findings horrifying. An agency within HHS examined cases where organ donation was authorized but ultimately not completed. 351 cases in total. Among those 351 cases, over 100 raised red flags, including at least 28 patients who may not have been dead at the time organ procurement was initiated. Secretary Kennedy says the organ procurement organizations that coordinate access to transplants will be held accountable. And joining us to discuss is seasoned trial attorney at GLK Law, Laby. Avi, it's a stunning development. Should American organ donors be concerned?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. We here at Gersowitz, Lebo & Cork, we fight for all victims who are injured as a result of negligence. One of our unfortunate cases involves organ donation, where the entirety of someone's organs, skin, teeth, fingernails, etc. were unfortunately harvested at a New York City hospital without the consent of either the decedent or the family. So this really brings a lens that's been brought federally on the organ procurement organizations, the OPOs, what rules govern them and what are the things that they need to do to make sure that the most vulnerable are protected.
What do they need to do?
So the real question is we have to start with, is the person actually dead? There are two ways to define death. Just generally, there is circulatory death or brain death. One involves the loss of cardiac function in the heart. The other is irreversible cessation of functions in the brain. So the number one thing is to make sure that the person is indeed confirmed dead by independent doctors. The next issue is the issue of consent. Did the person agree to donate one organ, all of their organs? Do they have a donor card? If someone is, for example, found without any ID, what are the steps that the organ procurement organizations and the hospitals need to take to identify that person? We have a specific case that's been in the news recently where our decedent had a piece of paper with her name on it. We have a photo of it and it was referenced in the hospital record. That begs the question of, did the people at the hospital actually search for this person's family to see if they could get the consent? Or did something else happen where monetary incentives kind of outweighed going through all the steps and balances to get that consent?
Why would something like this happen? I understand there's a need for organs, but isn't the person who is obviously there in the hospital the first priority to make sure that they live?
Of course. So let me start with, I think we can all agree there is a dire need in our country for organs. There are more people that need an organ donation than there are organs or donors available. So there's clearly something has to be done to make this more ethical and more fair. So I just want to put that to the side. There need to be specific rules, a specific path that the hospital has to go through before the organs can be procured. There should even be maybe the extra step of, if someone is not identified, there has to be more time or an extra step that has to come through, because the way the system works now, where every state is kind of controlling themselves, there is something I just want to inform the viewers. There is something known as the UDDA, the Uniform Determination of Death Act. There's also something called the DDR, the Dead Donor Rule, which is a general understanding that organs should not be taken from anyone who is not dead. So I really see this as a need for uniformity, where all states in the country all follow the same rules, as opposed to the Wild West, where the money, the incentives of getting the organs and selling them, to universities, to people, privately, publicly, that's the issue, is the monetary carrot, so to speak.
Avi, please explain to us more from what you've gathered in your practice about that money flow.
We have come to an understanding that there is some sort of monetary incentive. Now, these are things that we have to kind of get to the bottom of and get more specifics of throughout our discovery in our case. But there is clearly a monetary incentive for hospitals in conjunction with organ procurement organizations, OPOs, to get as many organs as soon as possible. Now, unfortunately, that leads to, we'll say, fudging some corners or not specifically following steps that we believe should have been followed. For example, if someone is unidentified, a social media search should be done if the name is available. A background search, a fingerprint search, something needs to be ordered for these hospitals to do before jumping to the organ procurement, which to them means more money, more business.
Understood. Avi, what are the red flags families should watch for in hospital end-of-life decisions?
Unfortunately, I get asked this question a lot, and when we're speaking to families that have gone through things like this, make sure you read every single sheet of paper that you're asked to sign if you're a family member in that situation. Sometimes something might be a little hidden or in a little bit of smaller font where you're not sure exactly that what you're signing is what they're explaining to you. I would also be very weary if you're in that situation where a family member or loved one is towards the end of their life and all of a sudden, someone pops up, a social worker, a family liaison, they're called, someone from an organ procurement company whose goal it is to get you to sign on that dotted line. So my first thing is to be very weary, to make sure you're making this decision, both knowing what your family member or loved one wanted, and that you come to that decision knowing all of the facts. I've also urged everybody to look up to see if they have an organ donor card in their pocket, if they have an organ, the symbol of the organ on a New York State ID. That's going to be your first idea as to, it's something you have to worry about, I would say.
Very important to keep note of. Now, an article in the New York Times wants society to consider expanding the definition of death. How does that play into the story?
Yeah, that's a great question. This kind of begs the question of what happens if the body, the person, is artificially maintained alive, but technically brain dead or circulatory dead. So these are things that I think that we're going to see a wave of a change of legislation throughout the country, hopefully in a unified way, especially with the federal government getting involved, where the specific rule of dead donor rule. Organs can only be taken from someone who is naturally dead, either circulatory or brain. There has to be one set of unified rules where a hospital and an organ procurement company cannot step in, usurp the corner, go around the steps they're supposed to follow, and we need those rules to be the same in every single state in the country. I think that would be the best way to do that. And I know that there is legislation popping up across the country. Hopefully that we'll figure out a fair and ethical way to control this kind of up and coming situation.
I understand. Now let's talk about the scope of this. Secretary Kennedy said the organ procurement organizations that coordinate access to transplants will be held accountable. This investigation seems to be connected to an organization that operates out of Kentucky. But is the issue more widespread than that?
Yes, I mean, our office, Gersowitz, Lebo, and Corrick, we're both in New York and New Jersey throughout the state. We've gotten phone calls. We've looked at situations where it's happened in New York, in New York City. We actually had a case which a couple years ago changed the law as to who is allowed to be considered a next of kin in a case like this, which is called a loss of sepulcher case. In New York, a family has the right, this is New York specific, a family has the right to control and bury the remains of their loved one or their family member. So actually at our office, we had a case where unfortunately a situation happened where the family was very religious of the Muslim faith, and all the organs were procured without the consent of the family. And we actually changed the law to open it up for the entire family has a right. So I would say every state would have specific case law, and we also have case law from the Supreme Court dealing with these issues. For example, we don't allow euthanasia. We don't allow doctors to kill patients. That's not, technically not allowed. So it really comes down to case law and a unified federal rule.
Well, Avi, Laby, thank you for coming on and talking to us about this very important issue.
Thank you so much, and appreciate it, and we'll be back soon.